Hello and welcome back to Girl Talks to Camera about her opinions on things. And today, I actually don't have an opinion piece, I have a research piece, specifically research that I did for a university essay on a window fragment entitled Princess Cecily, which is currently at the Burrell Collection in Glasgow. This research, I was so surprised how still interested in it I was by the end of it after writing the essay and doing the research on it for like a month and going to see it in person a couple times. I was still so surprised that I was still very much interested in it because I think it had a lot of history and mystery as well. So I think I'm just gonna go ahead and go into it. So what I chose was a stained glass window fragment of Princess Cecily, who was the daughter of King Edward IV. She is a gorgeous piece and she dates from 1483. I will get into that date later. But she is part of the royal window at the Canterbury Cathedral. And this window has been very much changed since its original kind of look, I guess. Its originalness, okay? She is part of the donor portion of the window. So in the very bottom register of this window would have been the donor aspects of it, and which had her entire family. Starting on the left was Prince Richard, and then Edward Prince of Wales, and then it was King Edward IV, and then in the middle was a crucifix, followed by the mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and the sisters, meaning Elizabeth of York, Princess Cecily of York. I think it then went Anne, Bridget, Catherine. I'm not sure about that. I will check that. So Cecily was obviously a part of that line. She would have been in the middle, like, because she was one of the eldest. In fact, it says that she's the second eldest, which isn't true. She's the third eldest, but she was the second living daughter at the time of that creation. So the wider window on the top register would have been like apostles, saints, like canonized ecclesiastical thing, so saints. It also had a giant crucifix, and it also had the seven joys of the Virgin. And we know this basically by a description in 1643 by Richard Colmer. I will also get into him later. He is a problematic figure in this story. So the donor aspect of the window would have been on the very bottom register. And we know this just because of Richard Colmer's description of it and how donor windows worked at the time. They would have been, if not a noble window, it would have been something that a couple people would have bought into. It would have been something for your community that you bought into that was also worked with the local priest of what to actually put on display. So this could have been a scene from the Bible, it could have been showing an ecclesiastical, like canonized ecclesiastical saint, or it could have been anything really. It could have been a picture of your cat if you wanted it to, but most likely it would have had some reference to you or your name, maybe a portrait of you, maybe just your badge, maybe your like name just engraved in the corner. But obviously for a noble patron, they decided to put their portraits in it. When you're a noble patron of a window, you want people to see who you are. You want that connection to be drawn as if you were working with the church and you created this good deed for yourself and for all of England to see, basically, because Canterbury Cathedral was a pilgrimage cathedral, and it was visited a lot mainly because of the cult of St. Thomas Becket, which was a canonized ecclesiastical, which was portrayed in the window. He was portrayed in the window. So there was a lot of visitors coming in and out of Canterbury Cathedral. So to show yourself as the king and have that connection to the church was a big deal at the time, and it would have showed that kind of propaganda aspect to stained glass windows. Canterbury Cathedral is kind of known for its wider window scheme. The royal window is located in the northwest transept, and it has been moved around and shifted. Currently, the donor portion, which would have been at the bottom, is now in the middle kind of register. The saints survive at the top with the apostles and a couple badges, but mainly the donor portion survives, and it's kind of known as the royal window because of the surviving donor portraits that show King Edward IV. It was created during the time of the War of the Roses. It was at the very end of the War of the Roses, probably about around the third battle. it was made at a time of this chaos and civil war around England and Britain. The reason it was so important to be made during the Civil War is because you wanted to show your security in your line. He wanted to show his giant family, he wanted to show he had 2 sons, and he had 5 daughters. He actually had like 6 or 7 daughters, I'm pretty sure. But these were the ones portrayed in the window. Because of the kind of confusing events of the War of the Roses, we can distinguish exactly when this window was created, because there is like a step-by-step, like month-by-month description of the War of the Roses, because it was such a tumultuous time and so many people were coming in and out of power. Edward IV came into power, I think, in 1471. Before then, he was known to visit Canterbury a bit in the 60s and a lot in the 70s, almost coming like for week-long visits at times. So he was very much known in that kind of area. The reason we can kind of date it with some accuracy to 1483 is mainly because of who is in the window. Elizabeth York is the oldest daughter. She is identified as the oldest, but then it goes to the second eldest, which of Cecily, who is not the second eldest, but she's actually the third eldest. Her elder sister Mary died on the 23rd of May of 1482, and Edward IV died in April of 1483, so we can date that this window was created sometime in between there, after Mary had died and before Edward had died and before the 2 sons died in June of 1483. So this window had a very specific time frame for its creation and its start to be built, and we can kind of know that by who's in the window, mainly because of the dating of Cecily as the second eldest daughter. Also at the time, because of the usurpation of Richard III in 1483, we know that the window would have halted work. It would have not gone on, especially at such a tumultuous time. It would have seen as like supporting the other side, supporting the Yorks instead of the Lancasters. So it would have been a big no-no for the church to continue work on the window. So the work was halted probably until 1486, when it was completed, probably around 1486 or 1487, due to the eldest, who is portrayed in the window, Elizabeth's marriage to Henry VII, which ended the War of the Roses in 1485, 1486 kind of deal. So the window would have been worked on again, and we also kind of know what the window would have looked like as well, because of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's window in the Great Melvin Priory. We know that those were pretty similar windows just based on the descriptions, and because we still have the one at Great Melvin Priory, so we can point to it and say, look, these are the same. So another kind of aspect that goes into dating a window, or like kind of talking about it, is its attribution. So a lot of the times makers would put their marks on stained glass, or would have some engraving on it saying that it was this workshop. We know who the noble glazier was an Englishman at the time, but he was probably not the hand of the donor portion of the royal window. We know that the larger window probably was an English hand, just because of the difference in the donor portion of the window. It is very much a more realistic type of window. It tries its hand at having those 3D elements that were more popular on the continent at the time, in Europe, and specifically by Netherlandish hands. This would have been kind of similar to Hugo van der Goes, who is known for his early work at like trying to get that 3D aspect into his paintings, and his paintings would have been known, so another hand could have just copied his style, or better yet, another Netherlandish or Flemish hand glazier could have recreated this very popular style at the time. So it was most likely that this donor portion of the window came from that international hand, and it was an international style that was popular in the 15th century. So it was most likely not made in England, and in fact a lot of people in London at the time were complaining because there were people immigrating in and taking these glazing jobs from like regular English glazers. We kind of know all this by Richard Colmer's description, but we have to take him with a grain of salt, because in 1643, on December 13th, Taylor Swift's birthday, doing this on Taylor Swift's birthday, he is an iconoclast, so he comes in with a group of other people and he breaks a lot of the statues, any windows that might have been seen as idolatrous. He calls the royal window the great idolatrous window. He writes about all of this, like destruction, and the description of the royal window that we know from in 1644, when he kind of like publishes in the Canterbury News, the cathedral news of the time. He should not be trusted. He called the window the great idolatrous window when it is not the great idolatrous window. But anyways, he describes himself probably taking a pickaxe and picking out the window frames. So he broke most of the royal window and most of it doesn't survive, but the donor portion does survive, with some interesting kind of twists. So after his kind of great destruction of Canterbury Cathedral and going in and taking a lot of art away, a lot of the ancient glass weirdly survives. It was very pick and choose what survived and what didn't. I don't know. Ask Richard Colmer. Don't ask me. A lot of the times too, he was taking out panes of glass. So around 13 chests were saved in the deanery for restoration, and a lot of the glasses were replaced in 1660 and 1661 after the kind of whole iconoclast attack on art was kind of blown over. The area really liked the stained glass of Canterbury Cathedral, so they replaced it and just kind of put it back. But a lot of the times, sometimes they put things back in the wrong order, which happens to the donor window. Usually it was the eldest. It was in line of like eldest to youngest, and the sisters get swapped. So there's a portion with the 3 youngest and there's the 2 eldest, which are kind of separate. The 2 eldest should have come after Elizabeth Woodville, but are now at the end, and the 3 youngest are now by Elizabeth Woodville. These were swapped basically. And is not sure why they swapped it, and they moved the donor, it would have been at the lowest, they moved it to the middle portion to just kind of fill the space, because they didn't have that much space, basically. And this is kind of the last we hear about the royal window from primary sources until 1774, when William Gosling describes it. There was a big uptick in antiquarians being interested in all these little historical niches, but William Gosling is basically one of those antiquarians, and he comes in and he describes the royal window, and we kind of know him from this description, although he gets some things wrong. He translates some of the Latin inscriptions wrong. Because of his writings, there was a restoration campaign in 1789, and now this is where things kind of get a little hairy for Princess Cecily. Madeline Caveness, who is a leading expert on the stained glass of Canterbury and a leading expert on medieval stained glass, she thinks that at this point, the 3 eldest daughters are taken out for cleaning. So Elizabeth, Cecily, and Anne are taken out for cleaning. But we don't know who or what work happened in the 1789 restoration, so we have no definitive proof of when these portions were taken out. We know that the 3 eldest daughters are not the original portraits, but also at this time was a very big trend going on of these restorers going in and taking out portions of original windows and selling them to collectors. A lot of the times these collectors would buy from these glaziers from dubious sources, and there are a couple art collectors who even acknowledge that some art is coming from dubious sources, and they try to say don't buy them from these sources. But of course, they're still bought, so it is possible that another collector would have bought up some of these window fragments, but I say otherwise. 1879, another restoration campaign took place by Samuel Caldwell Sr., not to be confused with Samuel Caldwell Jr., but Samuel Caldwell Sr. was a glazier for Canterbury at the time until his retirement, I think in 1906. Was when he retired. So he was working at this 1879 campaign, and this is kind of recorded by Emily Williams in 1897. Lots of 9s and 7s going on. I'm so sorry. There's a restoration campaign in 1879, and Samuel Caldwell Sr. is the one doing the restoration. We think, we, as in me, is that by this time, they think that the 3 eldest daughters had already been taken out. I say otherwise. I believe that Samuel Caldwell Sr. did the restorations. He was already replacing the heads of the figures from the earlier restoration campaign in 1789, but he would have had access to all of these heads and these little portions of windows, so I think it was Samuel Caldwell Sr. who took out the portion of this window. Now, this is going against like all experts in this, Bailey, Madeline, Cavaness. I do believe it was taken out by Samuel Caldwell Sr. I just don't have any proof for it, but the timeline fits. Because after this, it was probably sold to Arthur Locke Radford and F.W. Bruce. But, of course, Radford's records are destroyed in World War II, so we have actually no way of knowing when or where he bought it from, but it was most likely from Samuel Caldwell Sr. And the next we hear of the Princess Cecily fragment. It was displayed in the V&A from 1915 to 1919. But Elizabeth and Anne also taking out around the same time of either the 1789 or 1879 restorations, whatever you want to believe. Anne and Elizabeth are lost. We don't know where the original fragments are, so unless they show up again, there's no way of knowing, and probably no way of knowing where they've been all this time. But I like to think that Cecily was not lost for 100 years and just like sitting in storage, because that feels sad, and I hope that she was taken out in 1879, just because it feels sad to take her out in 1789 when she wasn't bought again until Radford and Bruce. She gets displayed in the V&A in 1915 into 1919. After this, Grosvenor, Thomas, and William Drake buy the Princess Cecily fragment, but Grosvenor dies. He dies in 1923, and his son, Roy Grosvenor Thomas, why do people have to make things more confusing for historians and name their sons that take over business for them? It's the same with Samuel Caldwell Sr. and Jr. There's confusing timelines, there's overlap, people die, and people name their son the exact same name as themselves, and it's actually infuriating because I didn't realize Roy Grosvenor Thomas and Grosvenor Thomas were 2 different people for so long. Anyways, Grosvenor Thomas and Roy Grosvenor Thomas and William Drake are one of the main dominating stained glass window trade of the entire transatlantic art collecting trade at the time. Now, this was a big time for stained glass window trade, especially because when you're collecting stained glass, it was usually fragments. You weren't collecting an entire giant window. Where are you going to put that in your house unless you have a giant mansion, which most of these people actually kind of did, but they much preferred to take the fragments. The fragments were taken and they were usually displayed near their windows or on their windows. Sometimes collectors got a little too big for their britches and just had a bunch of stained glass just laying around. There are so many records of people just having a bunch of stained glass just laying around and not displayed in a window at all, and it's so sad because they don't get that glorious light kind of coming in, and it's just so sad. I need to take a breath. Roy Grosvenor Thomas and William Drake have the window. They do try to sell it back to Canterbury in 1937. It's not clear why this wasn't successful. Canterbury didn't want it. I guess they said, we already have a Princess Cecily head, why do we need another one? But I just need to show you the comparisons between the Princess Cecily head that's there now that Samuel Caldwell Sr. did and the original fragment of Cecily. I mean, I would have taken back the original fragment if I were them, but I'm not Canterbury Cathedral. I'm just an art history student, so it's actually insane what they did to my girl in the Canterbury in the restorations. Oh, she's so pretty. She's so pretty. Like, she's gorgeous. Probably a little bit propaganda that she's meant to look that good. But, you know, she's still really pretty, and I love her. I tried to sell it to Canterbury in 1937. It's unsuccessful. I don't know why. They don't have the funds. Maybe they said, we already have this one. Why do we need this one? Kind of sad if you ask me. But it was sold to William Burrell in 1939, giving Cecily an official home after like so many years of turmoil, and now in the Burrell Collection. It was located in Glasgow, which opened to the public in 1942, I believe. 1942. The current display of Cecily. First off, she's separated from her family. She is separated from her family and the original donor portion of the window. So she is a fragment. Doesn't have her original home anymore, and it's very sad. Like, to think that she could have been displayed with some of her original fragments of her father and her mother and her brothers, but alas, she is not. She's in the Burrell Collection, which is a safe home and it's safekeeping, but a lot of the Burrell advertisement is around Cecily, is around this glorious window of the fragment of Cecily. I think partly because she is portrayed as this beautiful girl who's kind of mysterious. She's not, like, in her original context, though, because in her original context, she would have been kneeling with her family in this giant window in Canterbury Cathedral, in this architectural domain where you're surrounded by other stained glass windows. It completely changes how you view the piece. It completely changes how you specifically view Cecily. If you're viewing her among the family, you're getting the idea of her amongst her family, right? And you're getting the idea of, this is within the church, this is a holy place, blah, blah, blah. You get the idea. You're in a church, you're in a cathedral where it's all this original ancient stained glass surrounds you. But in the Burrell Collection, you go up these stairs. So you're on the ground floor, and then you go up the stairs kind of up towards like the first floor, and she's right there. She's by herself. I will say they do display her by a window, but you know, Scottish weather. I don't even know how many times she gets sun a year, versus in Canterbury, although Canterbury you probably also don't get the best weather either. But she's displayed by herself in between these black, like, lined bars, and it feels like she's like behind bars. She's in now a museum context, an art museum context, where it is now a part of a collector's view of what the art should mean, of what the piece should mean, and not within its original context, but in fact, a lot of his collection was curated, and a lot of other collections from the 19th century and from the 20th century have been curated to show how great the collector is and how great the taste of the collector has been. So for Burrell to display this, it's kind of showing, look how great I am, look how good looking of a collection I have. Takes away from the medium, in my mind. Because a painting or a sculpture, things that are meant to be displayed in museums where they can be fully displayed and fully on show, but stained glass, especially original medieval stained glass, I think should be in its original context. That's how you enjoyed stained glass back then. You can walk in the footsteps of the monks of the priory, you can walk in the footsteps of pilgrims, and you get a completely different sense, and you are transported in a church surrounded by ancient stained glass, versus when you're not so muchly transported in an art gallery. You are transported in a way, but in a way of you're thinking about the art within the context of the collection, within the context of this collector who has just made like the best examples of all these pieces. So it feels a little fake, and I kind of feel sorry for Cecily. I think she's a beautiful piece, and I think she shouldn't be moved because she's already there, and Canterbury Cathedral has already said like they don't want her. Maybe they'll give her back, but the thing was, when Burrell bought it, he had it cut down and he removed some of the background, so you can kind of see like the piece that's like a little bit of a different background compared to like the rest of it. He uses that in a different window just called like the crucifix. I'm gonna try to find a picture of where I think he used that portion of glass, but I don't know for sure. It loses its context. It takes away from her. I don't like it. I feel sad for her. I also feel sad for the fact that Elizabeth and Anne have been lost. It's also just a stained glass window, and it's not a real actual person, and there are bigger issues in the world. It's a very long history of Cecily, and it goes through almost like 400, 500 years of history. So the fact that she survived this long, I think, is also just a telltale sign of just how much like people like this window, and especially her and her portrait. And I think a lot of the times it's when you search up Princess Cecily, that fragment is the fragment used to show her portrait. I mean, it was not a big deal at the time, this portrait. It was seen as something that followed trends, so it wasn't like a new thing, I guess, to have a portrait of Cecily, but I think the context of what she's gone through makes her more important, and I think her story just needs to be told, so I'm telling it now. I would like to say, do not trust me in all of this. I could be wrong in some portions. I just researched this for a month, and it's not like this is my whole life. I think her story just needed to be told. So yeah, that's it. That's been Girl Talking to the Camera about a fragment of a window of Princess Cecily.